Welcome to Devotions with Dave. It's Wednesday, April 1st, no fooling. I'm coming to you from in front of the Space Invaders wall, and we're going to be studying Mark chapter 9 today in Devotions with Dave. The common theme here, similar to chapter 8, in that we're really trying to figure out what it means to believe in Jesus. But we see in this chapter really more of the struggle of the disciples and their faith and their understanding. In chapter 8, there was opposition, the yeast of the Pharisees and all that. And this time it's really just Jesus, his disciples. They're really struggling. What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? How do we do this? There's 5 sections to this. I'm only going to be studying 3 of them today. By the way, if you haven't read chapter 9, you really should do so before you watch the video. The first 13 verses is the Transfiguration. And Jesus just takes 3 of his disciples up on this mountain. And there's this, his countenance is transfigured. All of a sudden, there's Jesus talking with Moses and Elijah, and there's this powerful exchange, and the disciples are just completely clueless. What does this mean? Who is Jesus? We don't really know. They're really confused, as I'm sure we all would have been. In the second section, verses 14 to 29, the disciples are unable to help this boy who's possessed with a demon. His dad brings him, and the disciples just can't do it. And Jesus has to come in and do it. We see through this their struggle with faith before Jesus sent them out, and everything just worked. And so it's almost like, are they lacking in faith? Are they wavering? We're not really sure, but we just see things just aren't quite right. In the next 3 sections, the one I'm going to be going over today, the third section, Jesus tells it of his upcoming death and resurrection. This is verses 30 to 32. Very similar to what we saw in chapter 8. And we're going to see this a recurring theme. Jesus is really trying to help his disciples figure this out. And then in chapter or part 4, the disciples, instead of focusing on following Jesus, are arguing about who's the greatest. They're having a major competition amongst them. Again, showing that their belief, that their faith is really lacking. And then finally, the last section, verses 38 to 50, is dealing with, there were some outsiders using Jesus' name to cast out demons, and the disciples were very offended by that, and Jesus responds to that. So I'm going to start with the third part, verses 30 to 32, where Jesus tells of his upcoming death and resurrection. And in this section, Jesus is quietly traveling with his disciples, trying to spend some alone time with them, and he tells them what's going to be happening soon. And from chapter 8, he basically says, I'm going to be killed, I'm going to rise from the dead in 3 days. And then in chapter 9 here, he expands a little more. We're going to see in chapter 10, he expands even further. He really wants them to understand. Here he says, I'm going to be betrayed to my enemies. And then I'm going to be killed. Then I'm going to rise on the 3rd day. So it's not just death, resurrection, but there's this betrayal going on too. And the disciples really don't understand what Jesus meant, we're told. But by this time, they're a little bit afraid to ask. And I don't know if it's because the last time he did this and Peter pulled him aside, Jesus yelled at him and called him Satan. You're looking at human interests, not God's. Or, was it the fact that they weren't able to cast out the demon-possessed boy and Jesus had to do it for him? But whatever it is, they're like, I think it's just better if we don't ask. They don't get it, but they're afraid to ask because they know they just really haven't been living up to Jesus' expectations. So, but the heart of this is Jesus wants his disciples to know what's coming. They just can't wrap their heads around him. He's told them twice now, I'm going to be killed, I'm going to die, and I'm going to rise from the dead on the 3rd day. And they just can't seem to get their heads around Jesus, this healer, that he can raise the dead. He's a mighty teacher, a prophet, that he's going to be killed, and then rise from the dead. Like, what does that even mean? Maybe they're thinking he's speaking in some sort of analogy that they can't quite understand. But it makes me realize that faith is such a spiritual thing. As much as I'm a rational person and I come to you and I teach, there's elements to this that are they're beyond reason. It's a spiritual thing. There's a spiritual truth. We don't understand why some people believe and some don't. We don't even understand why sometimes we want to believe more, but we seem to struggle with it. But we know that there are a lot of human barriers that get in the way. And one of the things through this teaching, I want us to identify, what are those barriers that are keeping me from fully believing and trusting in Jesus, that I can just, trust him with my whole heart. And so chapter 9 is a struggling time for Jesus followers. They know him more than anybody else in the world at this time. They've seen his power, they've experienced firsthand the miracles, but yet they're just in this time of they don't quite get what's going on. And that's what's happening here. Jesus is trying to tell them, they're not getting it. And we really tell they're not getting it when we move into part 4, verses 33 through 37, where they're arguing about who's the greatest. So as they're traveling down the road, the disciples are talking among themselves, kind of maybe talking a little smack. Well, Peter's like, well, I was the first one to say I knew he was the Messiah. And, maybe John has said, well, I was with him when he was on the Mount of the Transfiguration. But anyway, they're trying to figure out who's the greatest, and they're arguing about it. And they think they're being secretive from Jesus, but when they arrive at their destination, they get to Capernaum. Jesus says to them, hey, what were you guys talking about on the road? Of course, he already knows, but they don't want to answer because they're competing, and they're talking about who's going to be better or greater than anybody else. And so Jesus decides this is a time to teach them. And he says, whoever wants to be first must take last place and be a servant. And if you've heard any of Jesus' teachings, you've heard these things before, but they're pretty radical. You want to be first, you serve. You want to be first, find a way to be in last place and not exalt yourself. This is radical teaching, and a very opposite of where the disciples were at this moment. So then he does something. He gets a child and puts it in the middle of them, and he welcomes the child, and he says that welcoming this child is the same thing as welcoming Jesus. And if you welcome Jesus, you welcome the Father. So if you take some innocent kid, and let's face it, kids are cute, but in reality, they don't know a whole lot. They can't do a whole lot, and yet they think they can. But if we welcome, to spend time with children, you have to lower your ego, and you have to care about them and realize that they can't do everything for themselves. So you welcome a child, it's like welcoming Jesus, like welcoming the Father. It's a way of putting yourself in last place, of saying, I'm going to be a servant. I'm going to care about someone who can't care about themselves. Interesting. It's a very selfless act. So whenever, Jesus teaches stuff that's just so amazing and it brings questions in my mind. When he says, what does it mean, or how does putting yourself in last place make you first? Because if you're in last place, you're in last place, right? You're not first. So how does that work? Well, the reality is if you put yourself in last place, you make yourself a servant. In earthly, situations, you are in last place, but you become first in love. You become first in godliness. You become first as you try and become like Jesus and take on his character. So it's not like, I think sometimes we think, well, if I just sacrifice today and give someone money, that means tomorrow I'm going to get a bunch of money. I don't think it works that way. It might. God blesses us in crazy ways, in mysterious ways. But what it's really saying is you're taking this earthly situation and you're going to put yourself last. You're going to be a servant. And what you gain is love, compassion, self-control. Like as God works in you, he works on the inside. And so in this COVID-19 global pandemic world we live in, we've been seeing some of the, I'm going to put myself first. We've been seeing some of the hoarding, fighting over supplies, videos of people fighting over packages of toilet paper, things like this, and other attempts to be first in the earthly situation. We've been given the choice to say, you can put yourself last. And the great thing is we're seeing even that. Even though we might be seeing the struggles, we're seeing great selfless acts. People giving away food, people, taking time to donate, to help the terrible hot spots and situations. People even making masks. I have a couple people in my family that are great seamstress that are making masks. I'm like, wow, that's awesome. So we see doctors and nurses putting their lives on the line. And so we're seeing the I'm going to make myself last and people suffering because of it. But they're becoming first in God's order of things. So the question I ask you is, how are you doing? Are you first or are you last? Are you able to make yourself last, to sacrifice? And maybe what areas might God be calling you to do that? So now we get to section 5, and this was my favorite of the chapter. And I'm calling this Jesus, or outsiders using Jesus' name. And kind of that sparks a whole teaching thing from Jesus. This is Mark chapter 9, verses 38 through 50. And so John comes in and announces to Jesus that they saw someone using his name to cast out demon. But don't worry, he says, we stopped him because he wasn't part of our group. And think about that. John comes in, he thinks he's done a good thing. Someone was using your name, Jesus, but we don't even know him, so we stopped him. Jesus says, though, don't stop him. And I think this shocked the disciples. It might shock us, too, a little bit. He says, if someone is using Jesus' name, he says, he's not going to be speaking evil of me, Jesus says. And they will actually be rewarded for doing good in Jesus' name. So you don't need to stop someone from doing good, okay? That's an okay thing to happen. But then Jesus decides to teach them some more on behavior, and specifically how we interact with others, how causing harm or causing someone to sin, who is someone who's trying to follow Jesus, what a terrible thing that is. He says, and then he says some very extreme things. It's better for you to be drowned than for you to cause someone who trusts in Jesus to fall. Basically says a millstone, which is like a giant anchor, to have that tied around you and thrown into the water. It'd be better for that than for you to cause someone who's putting their trust in Jesus to fall and fall away. And then he goes on. He says, it's better for you if a part of your body causes you to sin. If your hand or your foot causes you to sin, cut them off. It's better for you to enter God's kingdom without a body part than for that to tear you down. He says, if it's your eye, gouge your eye out. Now, this is pretty extreme, and today most people don't do that, right? But we realize that Jesus is saying you need to take seriously how sin harms you and it can harm the people around you. Don't let it drag you down. Don't use it to drag others down. And so avoiding sin is a big deal. And Jesus is obviously saying, you stop people from doing good. You should not do that. Don't do that, John. And then finally, Jesus ends this where he tells them that they're going to be tested with fire. And he makes this analogy with salt. And every time I hear tested with fire, I think about purifying metals. But I really don't think that's what this is here. I don't think this is tested with fire like you have impure silver, but you fire it up and the impurities can be taken away and then it's more pure. I mean, that's a great analogy. But here he's talking about salt. And I've never taken and tested salt in fire. I might have to try that. But my guess is if you burn salt, it's not very good. I don't think you'd want to then put it on your eggs or your French fries. And he's basically saying when salt is burned, it loses its flavor. It's useless. And then he tells his followers that they have to have the quality of salt among each other and live in peace. I know for me, when I have, if I were to make potato chips and there were no salt on them, they'd be awful. I know back in the late 70s and early 80s, a really cool, popcorn went from being made on the stovetop where you just bought it in a bag, threw oil in a pan, threw the popcorn in and popped it, to now they had popcorn makers. See, were these hot air things. And what would happen is you'd put just a little oil in, and then you'd put the thing would circulate the popcorn and it would pop out. The problem is if you didn't add salt, it just tasted awful. You could make the most bland, awesome, not so awesome popcorn in the world, and popcorn without salt is awful. Potato chips without salt is awful. Eggs without salt is awful. And Jesus is saying, if you're out in the world and you're not bringing flavor by how you live, that's bad. It's useless. It's no good. And so in response to John bashing this guy for using his name, he's saying, no, you got it all wrong. We want to be not hassling people, shutting people down. We want to be adding flavor. And so what's interesting is, some observations. This section is really focused on the disciples, kind of the insiders. This is our group, and how we react to outsiders. So Jesus is trying to teach them, yeah, we have our group and we know what we're doing, but it doesn't, our good behavior, our serving God doesn't stop there. It's got to reach outside. He said, first thing, don't make them your enemy. And also, don't cause them to sin by provoking them or isolating or shunning them. Make sure you treat them well. And then that's when he gives it'd be better for you to drown than to cause them to fall into sin just because they're not a part of your group. Okay, don't do that. So we're told, be salt. We want to add quality to everything we do. Be salt. We want to live in peace. We want to love others, especially outsiders. Some further observations. I think in general, people struggle with other people who are not part of their group. When someone is an outsider, when someone is not part of your circle, I think we struggle. Especially if they're different, right? We don't know them. We might not trust them. They do things differently than us. Jesus tells us, don't make them the enemy, and be very careful how you treat them. Be salt. So, makes me ask you a question. Do you have problems with people you don't know, with people who are not like you, with people who can be outsiders? Do you have a hard time with them? Do you have a hard time trusting them? In our society, it's very easy to get polarized. It's very easy to say, this is us and this is them. I generally keep my political opinions to myself. You don't usually hear me talking about my politics. And there's a reason for that. Because right now, our country is very polarized. About half are Republican and about half are Democrat. And if when you come out strong with your political opinion, my concern is I don't want to then be saying, well, now I hate all you on the other side. I appreciate people's different political points of views. I happen to have my own, but they're not so important to me that I want to isolate them, make them my enemy, make them an outsider. And I'm thankful for those of you that do the same. Now, we all know that there are people who can take this too far, and when someone views things differently than them, they make them their enemy. Jesus is saying, don't do that. I'd rather be salt, and I challenge you to be salt too. So this brings me to my the key verse, and I had a hard time with this, but and it's very similar to Mark 8, and its key verse, and so I chose verses 31 and 32. And because to me, the heart of this chapter is about discovering who Jesus is and what he's called us to do. And let me read verses 31 and 32. It says, he said to them, Jesus is talking, the Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of his enemies. He will be killed, but 3 days later he will rise from the dead. And then, to me, really, 32 is the key verse. They didn't understand what he was saying. However, they were afraid to ask him what he meant. And at this point, we see the disciples not getting who Jesus is and struggling to follow him because they're not sure what's really going on. Now, Jesus is continuing to try and help his disciples know his Good Friday is coming soon. He's going to be going to Jerusalem. They're going to arrest him. He's going to die. And he's going to rise from the dead. And as they approach this, Jesus is trying to help them see what's coming on. Good Friday's coming. Easter's coming. They just don't understand. They just don't get it. So for us also, Good Friday and Easter are coming. We're about a week and a half away from Good Friday and 12 days from Easter. And so as you're spending time in prayer, as we're studying together the Gospel of Mark, ask God to help you to truly know who Jesus is. We don't want to be like the disciples, be so close to Jesus, but not really get him, right? We don't want that to happen. So we want, a great prayer. God, help me to understand you more. And as a result of that, to know you more. Ask God to help you understand him, to understand the truth that Jesus is teaching through the Gospel of Mark. And finally, ask God to help you to love others, especially outsiders, especially those you wouldn't consider part of your life or part of your group, that we could love them the way Jesus wants us to, that he teaches us here in Mark chapter 9. So until next time, keep the faith, keep walking with the Lord. Also keep social distancing, keep sanitizing, keep safe, and I'll see you next time on Devotions with Dave.